Okay, so this video will talk a little bit more about how to use the evidence that you've collected and organized to support your argument or support your thesis statement. So to start with, there's a couple of things that you need to do. A lot of them, some of them you've addressed already. So for example, we've talked about how to use academic sources and how to identify academic sources. And so we need to, now that you've got academic sources, you need to figure out kind of how to treat them fairly and respectfully. You need to make sure that your evidence is complete or relatively complete. So for example, if there's a big name that you've seen cited in a lot of the literature and you haven't found any work by them, you probably need to go look for them. You also need to remember to put citations where they're necessary, but also where they make sense. Often you put citations kind of at the end of a thought, so you'll put it kind of before a comma or other punctuation. If you have a long sentence, you don't necessarily want to save the citation for the very end if it's not clear what you're citing. You want to make sure that you're working as close to fact as possible and try to avoid beliefs, opinions, or preferences, things that are unprovable. So beliefs, you cannot prove beliefs. They may be true, but if we cannot prove them, we don't want to be talking about them. If you want to make an argument for something, but you don't necessarily have the evidence, you can use words like might or may to make clear that there's not evidence for what you're saying. So you might say something like, there's many studies that have shown that teachers can have a big impact on promoting acceptance among children, and then cite the studies that show that, and then put a comma and say something like, but teachers may also promote friendships among children. So you've kind of identified what you have evidence for and cited it close to where you're making the statement, and then also identify what you don't have evidence for. So a couple of ways that you can kind of make statements while avoiding or making sure that your statements are valid. One is to avoid generalizations. Something like shy children do not have friends. Okay, there are always exceptions. Many shy children or some shy children don't have friends, but not all shy children. So we see this a lot in student papers when you're reading an article and they've described a finding. They tend to use words like always or all or none or never. And this is problematic because, as you know, by the time you're seniors in psychology, there are always exceptions. So adding on words like on average or often can help you avoid these overgeneralizations. Being specific is another way to avoid generalization. So kind of clarifying the boundaries of what population this applies to. So an example of this is the Mozart effect. So the kind of common understanding of the Mozart effect is that people are smarter after listening to Mozart. This has even been generalized to mean that babies are smarter as adults if they've listened to Mozart as infants. The original study that tested this actually found that college students get higher IQ scores 5 minutes after listening to Mozart. And so by being specific about what the study found, we can avoid these overgeneralizations. It's important to remember that all studies have limitations, so it's okay to be critical of studies, even though those that support your argument. And kind of being aware of your own paper's limitations can also make your arguments more convincing. But you don't necessarily need to rip every study apart, and a study can have limitations but still be valid. So kind of if you have a study that you think is problematic, it can even be something like, children reported on depressive behavior, but there were no observations done, so we don't know how accurate those reports are. Things like that are valid limitations, but doesn't mean that we should completely discount the study's findings. It's also important to not just rely on one study. So you, of course, at this point, you are writing a 15-page paper, so I'd expect that you have many, many sources by this point, but you don't want to rely on just one study to support your thesis. If you've only got one study, you probably don't have very strong evidence. Okay. We've talked about a lot of these, being aware of logical fallacies, kind of understanding reasoning flaws that can affect your support of your thesis, avoiding opinions, and the last point is a good one, acknowledging counterargument. So if you go back and look at your rubric for this paper, one of the things you need to include is some kind of counterargument. You need to acknowledge that there's some perspective other than the argument that you're making. Your perspective, the alternative perspective, doesn't have to necessarily be the opposite. It can be another factor that might contribute. So if you're arguing that PTSD can negatively impact memory, okay, so that's your thesis statement. You're making an argument. Your counter argument could be something like, however, PTSD often co-occurs with depression, and it's not clear whether it's the depression or the PTSD that's causing the memory problems. Okay, so you're just acknowledging that there's another perspective there. You need to have a section in your paper that does this. So make sure you've thought about this and included this. And showing that you acknowledge other people's perspectives and then coming back to why your thesis is correct helps actually make your argument stronger. Okay, for this week, what I want you to experiment with is using a method called They Say, I Say. Now you have, I believe, 2 chapters to read on this. So I'm hoping this kind of clarifies, the chapters kind of clarify it. So if you haven't already read them, go and read them. But the idea is, and this is kind of a strategy you use in academic writing, you want to summarize other people's views in a fair and objective way. But you also want to have your own opinion. So you need to find a way to acknowledge what other people have found and use it to support or refute your own. So you need to kind of enter the conversation with other people's views, and then once you have their conversation in there, you need to kind of subsequently follow up with your own argument. Okay, so you have to make basically a unique contribution to the conversation. So you can disagree with a reason. So say, Smith and colleagues have argued X, Y, and Z. However, here's other evidence that shows the opposite. Or you can agree with the difference. So making a novel contribution by adding a fresh or unique idea. So don't just agree. So, Collins argued this and they're right. Add something else. They argued this, but we can take it even further and prove something else. Okay. Important components of this are that you want to distinguish what they say from what I say. So you want to use kind of citations or signal phrases to make the source attributions clear. So you want to kind of identify previous evidence has shown X, Y, and Z and cite that previous evidence. And then you want to kind of make that transition into what you're going to say. This supports my thesis in this way, or however, this is wrong in this way. And so you want to kind of anticipate and address the criticisms and limitations, things that you think people will be concerned about. And tell the readers why they should care about the arguments being made in the paper. So the They Say, I Say method is really about distinguishing kind of what others argue from what you argue. Now, in your They Say, I Say section of your paper that is due this week, what I want you to do is use this technique to write a piece of your final paper, a section of your final paper. Okay, so you can go back to your outline and decide, I'm going to write, I'm writing about social relationships in general. I'm going to pick the piece on friendship and write my section on friendship. So you're aiming for about 2 to 3 pages for this. So within this kind of mini section of your paper, you need a clear thesis or argument, and you need to use evidence to support it. You need to either disagree with a reason or agree with a difference. So either say, this argument is incorrect because, or yes, this argument is strong and we can add something else. And you need to kind of anticipate criticisms and address them. So getting at that counter argument component. And you should do this while avoiding using they say, I say. So this is called the they say, I say method, but you don't actually want to use that terminology. But the they say, I say, the idea is how you kind of frame the problem, or how you frame the approach to writing. Use this section that you're working on to also practice making sure that your paragraphs have topics and concluding sentences, making sure you have transitions or hooks between your paragraphs, and working on organizing the section. So this is basically a mini paper that you will use as a component of your final paper. So this shouldn't be something separate that you're writing. This should be a piece of your paper, one of your subtopics. And this is really just an opportunity for you to practice some of these strategies and work on how you're going to present the evidence, so that I can give you kind of detailed feedback on where you need to go. So again, the general gist of the they say, I say assignment is really to get you practicing using this approach of how to use evidence to support a thesis statement, and making clear what comes from the evidence and what comes from you, and also giving you practice on making sure that your paragraphs have these topic and concluding sentences and support your thesis.